Okay, we'd like to begin our lunch program. Well, it's my absolute distinct honor to be introducing our guest speaker, Peter Fisher. I've known him for a long time. So insightful, so reliable, so consistently outstanding. Background, among other things, I don't know quite where to start, but worked at the Federal Reserve Bank of New York, executive vice president and manager of the system open market account, which means he ran the then combined for the first time domestic and FX desks. Went on, and while he was there, he was the, I mean, you were on several, no, you weren't on any boards then until you got to the Treasury. Okay, then he went and he was Undersecretary of the Treasury for domestic, and there he represented the Treasury on the PBGC, right? And the board is the Securities Investors Protection Corp, right? Did I get that right so far? And then after the Treasury, he went to BlackRock, where he was head of all fixed income. Okay, and now still he is senior director of BlackRock Investment Institute, and is also a senior scholar, senior fellow at the Tuck School at Dartmouth, on the board of AIG, on the board of the Peterson Institute for International Economics. Stop there. The list goes on. It really does. And the reason why the list goes on is Peter's great, and we look forward to hearing his remarks.
Thank you, Mickey. That was too kind. That was too kind. Thank you all. It really is a treat, a pleasure. I was so glad I could be here all morning. So thank you for the honor of being here. Before I begin, let me thank my colleague Andy Levin from Dartmouth, who can't be here today, but I owe him a lot of thanks for his assistance in my remarks. But someone has to be teaching the students. We can't all be away from the Upper Valley. So the topic of my talk is, what's the matter with the Fed? And I think something's wrong with monetary policy. But my discontent has little to do with the level of the Fed's funds rate, and much to do with ideas that frame the Fed's view of the world and public understanding of the Fed. And let me quickly jump in off text, and with Michael Bordeaux channeling my good friend John Taylor say, I know we would be better off with some rules. I'm actually going to explore what led the Fed astray. What is the intellectual problem that got them away from rules? I understand why rules might help us. So I have here just 3 ideas. I've boiled it down to just 3 ideas about monetary policy that I believe are wrong. 3 ideas that I think have led the Fed and the public astray. So just 3. First, low long-term interest rates everywhere and always stimulate economic activity. Second, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation provides a complete and sufficient guide for monetary policy. And third, the Fed's decision-making process and communications are good enough for the world's largest economy and oldest constitutional democracy. To be clear, I disagree with each of these ideas. I think they're not true. And let me explain why and why it matters. And let me say my remarks will be available in the best version I have on the website, and some of them will be printed here available at the end of my remarks, as will some other remarks I gave a couple months ago that I'll refer to. So to begin, first, low long-term interest rates do not everywhere and always stimulate the economy. The shape of the yield curve, not the level of long-term rates, is the more important lever of monetary policy. So I understand how lowering long-term interest rates persistently would lower the discount rate on future cash flows and increase the value of financial assets and create a wealth effect that might marginally increase the propensity to consume. I get that. But how does pulling down the level of long-term interest rates stimulate the growth of credit? Simply asking this question for the last several years has made me something of a heretic. By lowering the discount rate, we can increase the price of existing assets. We will also have lowered the cost of borrowing for new borrowers, and in this way, we will have increased demand for credit. But to have an impact on aggregate demand for the whole economy, we need to stimulate maturity transformation and the production of new assets. We need to increase the supply of credit, don't we? So consider the following idea. Imagine if in political season this year, someone proposed that to solve the problem of hunger in America, that what we were going to do was take the combined powers of the federal government and use it to suppress agricultural prices as low as possible for as many years as possible. I get what would happen to demand, but what about the farmers? Forgive me, even Bernie Sanders would ask, what about the farmers? Why is it obvious that over several years, in the medium term, this would not work in farm products, but is so widely assumed that it would work for credit? This generation of economists has spent their lives working with models of the economy that included the assumption that if you lower long-term interest rates, both demand and supply of credit will expand. Having assumed this for so long, the idea that demand and supply of credit can be simultaneously determined by lower long-term rates has become part of the macroeconomic belief system. But that does not make it so. There are, however, special conditions in finance that can stimulate both the demand and the supply of credit. These special conditions are when short-term interest rates are lowered significantly and the change is expected to be temporary. These special conditions are reflected in a steep yield curve. Conventional monetary policy has in the past had a greater impact on short-term interest rates than on longer-term ones, leading to steep yield curves when monetary policy is easy and flat curves when monetary policy is tight. When yield curves steepen, lenders profit from the wider net interest margins. This provides a powerful incentive to engage in maturity transformation and expand the supply of credit. Borrowers face a different incentive. When the structure of the yield curve is at its lowest, provided it is expected to be temporary, borrowers face a time-limited opportunity to borrow at rates lower than are likely to prevail in the future. With these special conditions, lower short rates and a steep yield curve, we can simultaneously and strongly stimulate both the demand for and the supply of credit and create the acceleration of aggregate demand we associate with economic recovery. But to solve the zero interest rate boundary, the Fed decided that flat yield curves, not steep ones, would do a better job. Thus, the Fed's mantra was to bring down long-term rates, both with its balance sheet and its forward-guiding words. Now, in deference to the earlier panel today, I want to be very clear. If a central bank wants to expand its balance sheet in the face of evidence that monetary conditions are tight, I've got no problem with that. So whether we think about the ECB or the Fed, you want to expand the quantity, I get that. But where do you get the confidence to do an Operation Twist and dictate the appropriate price of long-term interest rates? Of course, none of us have access to the counterfactual. We do know that flatter yield curves reduce the incentive for maturity transformation from what otherwise would have been. So consider the following tragedy in 3 acts. In Act 1, we see Alan Greenspan in the early 1990s getting ready for bed. And before he turns out the light, he gets down on his knees and he prays. And he says, "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for the steep yield curve with which we are recapitalizing the American financial system." And in Act 2, we see the same scene, but Greenspan is 10 years older. And this time we hear him when he prays, he says, "Why me, Lord? Why do you torment me with this conundrum of low long-term interest rates? Don't you realize how this is hurting the recovery?" And in Act 3, it's 2012 or thereabouts, we no longer see Greenspan, and this time we see central bankers from all over the world having a party to celebrate their great success in creating persistently low long-term interest rates. And then we hear a few of them murmuring, asking themselves, why is bank lending and the recovery so weak? But they assure themselves sagely, headwinds. Before the crisis, the Fed was painfully naive about leverage in the financial system. From 2010 onward, the Fed did everything in its power to flatten the yield curve, creating a wealth effect, but retarding credit creation from what it might have been. This limited the stimulus to final demand. It also reduced revenues from maturity transformation that would have helped lenders repair their balance sheets. Now, I want to be very clear and no confusion. I'm not suggesting that higher long-term rates today would solve any of our problems. I'm pointing out a fateful choice that was made 6 years ago. Whether consciously or unconsciously, whether in haste or in ignorance, the Fed made a Faustian bargain to achieve wealth sooner but have trouble later, to pump up asset prices but to constrain maturity transformation and complicate the exit from extraordinary policies. Of course, the ubiquitous headwinds are holding back the Fed from normalizing rates. I get that. But the Fed's efforts to normalize policy are also being held back by a volatility trap of the Fed's own making. Once you start targeting financial asset prices, once you've created a wealth effect, when and how do you stop? That's the exit that's difficult. Monetary policy needs to be informed by an understanding of how the financial system works in fact, not just in theory. Monetary policy that is not based on a deep understanding of maturity transformation is not really monetary policy at all. 2, the trade-off between unemployment and inflation does not provide a complete and sufficient guide for monetary policy, either as a matter of experience or as a matter of law. So it recently occurred to me that in order to believe that the Phillips curve is a complete guide for monetary policy, one would also need to believe that deflation dynamics are simply the mirror image of inflation dynamics. I don't believe this. So the output gap and the nexus between aggregate demand and potential growth describe a set of forces that contribute to both inflationary and deflationary forces reflected in the Phillips curve. Permit me to label these type 1 forces. Without attempting a complete taxonomy, humor me and permit me to identify a second set of forces associated with changes in asset prices, particularly falling ones. We can think of asset price deflation or debt deflation as described by Irving Fisher, or balance sheet recessions as more recently described by Richard Koo. These concepts share a focus on the balance sheet combination of fixed liabilities and variable asset prices and the contractionary dynamics that occur when asset prices or incomes decline sharply relative to fixed liabilities. The experience of American farmers in the depressions of the 1870s and 1890s, our national experience in the Great Depression, our experience with the savings and loan crisis of the late 1980s, the underwater homeowners of 2006, and oil producers of 2016 all reflect this painful balance sheet mismatch. Let's call these type 2 forces. The gravest deflationary risks to price stability and also to stable output and employment occur when we experience both type 1 and type 2 deflationary pressures at the same time, as Irving Fisher so wisely observed in 1933. He also described how deflation caused by debt reacts on debt, creating contractionary forces that are hard to quell. Each dollar of debt unpaid becomes a bigger dollar, and if the over-indebtedness with which we start was great enough, the liquidation of debts cannot keep up with the fall in prices which it causes. In that case, the liquidation defeats itself. So why does this matter? Accommodative monetary policy, both before the crisis and since, intended to increase both asset prices and credit in order to reduce the risks of type 1 deflationary pressures from weak demand. But pushing asset prices and leverage higher also increases the risk of type 2 deflationary forces by exposing more balance sheets to greater volatility mismatches, as we so painfully discovered in the financial crisis. Why is it so hard for the Fed to acknowledge that prolonged periods of monetary accommodation may exacerbate the risks of future deflationary pressures? Wasn't it exactly a worry about the combination of type 1 and type 2 forces that inspired the Fed to its heroic actions in 2007 and 8? So shouldn't we be able to recognize ex ante that the risk of type 2 deflationary pressures should be a constraint on what accommodative policy can do to reduce the risk of type 1 pressures from weak demand? Is that beyond our ken? Sadly, former Governor Jeremy Stein was too lonely a voice on the Fed, arguing that monetary policy needs to take account of the risk of credit market overheating. I do appreciate that the Fed's two most recent chairs have not made the mistake that other central banks have of claiming that there are no limits on what accommodative policy can do to defeat deflation. But instead of acknowledging what those limits are, the Fed has conceived of there being a contrast between the objectives of monetary policy, defined as the so-called dual mandate, and the objectives of financial stability, which are deemed to be of distinct and secondary importance. This is misguided, as it ignores the deflationary risks that are a consequence of financial instability, as I argued in my remarks last month at the NABE conference in Washington. Unfortunately, the Fed has studiously avoided addressing these intertemporal trade-offs by claiming that its statutory mandate compels it to consider only a single trade-off between the goals of maximum employment and price stability. But Section 2A of the Federal Reserve Act does no such thing. There is no dual mandate from Congress. And lest anyone in this room is confused, I will read it to you in its entirety. The Board of Governors of the Federal Reserve System and the Federal Open Market Committee shall maintain long-run growth of the monetary and credit aggregates commensurate with the economy's long-run potential to increase production so as to promote effectively the goals of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates. By ignoring 31 out of 38 operative words in its actual mandate, the Fed has asserted de facto goal independence, even if the surprisingly gullible members of Congress appear to accept the Fed's faux fidelity to its statute. I'm open-minded about revising the Fed statute, but there are features of the actual mandate I would not want to give up. The Fed's actual mandate is to maintain the growth of money and credit commensurate with potential growth. Deep down, all central bankers understand that this is the essence of the job, reflecting the central importance of productivity. The Fed's actual mandate also has the benefit of focusing attention on the medium term, the only horizon over which one can sensibly think about calibrating money and credit growth with potential. As a means to the ultimate ends of maximum employment, stable prices, and moderate long-term interest rates, which must of necessity occur even further in the future. If monetary policy is simply trying to calibrate demand for resources with a supply of resources in a single temporal dimension in the near term, it will too heavily discount the risk of instability in the future. Monetary policy needs to recognize that type 2 deflationary pressures are a foreseeable consequence of accommodative policy. Monetary policy needs to aim its actions at more than one temporal dimension. So finally, my third point. The Fed's decision-making process and communications are not consistent with what we can and should expect. Legislative reform is needed to improve both the individual accountability and the democratic accountability of those who have a say in our nation's monetary policy. So the decision-making and communications of the Federal Open Market Committee reflect a phony consensus that obscures accountability and increases inertia. After its meetings, the committee issues a statement that members unanimously or nearly unanimously agree to. But each member anonymously makes their own projection of the expected path of forward overnight rates in the notorious dot plot. Members also seem to feel quite free to vote for the consensus but dissent in their speeches. This leaves the chair as the only member effectively accountable for the outcome. But the chair cannot act until she or he gets all or almost all of the voting members to agree, given the norm of decisions by consensus. Even more oddly, over the years, the committee has backed into the habit of striving not to change policy at its meetings, or more precisely, to avoid having its statements suggest a change in policy if at all possible. Monetary policy only has effect to the extent that it changes expectations. But the committee tries to avoid having its announcements disturb the market and seems to take pride that its statements do not change our expectations. In this way, the committee fabricates the impression that the market understands its reaction function, leaving actual changes in policy, the ones that do change our expectations, to occur somewhere other than in the committee's statements, most often in speeches by the chair. Imagine, if you will, if our Supreme Court routinely gave hints of its decisions in speeches by the Chief Justice. Imagine if we read the court's opinions principally to see if they ratified the Chief Justice's trial balloons. Imagine court watchers breathlessly awaiting speeches of the Chief Justice and presumed swing voters to find out which way particular rulings would likely come out. Imagine if the court almost always decided cases unanimously, but justices gave frequent speeches that reflected profound disagreements. Imagine how odd we would think it if the court's actual decisions rarely changed our understanding of the law. I don't think we would be proud of this. I think we would be embarrassed. The Fed's decision-making and communications process is broken and has been for some time. It reflects badly on the Fed's credibility and legitimacy. It undermines the Fed's actual independence, but explains the committee's reliance on decisions by consensus. I have come around to the Bank of England's approach of individual accountability. Each committee member should be accountable for their own vote as if they were the sole decision maker. The substantial benefit of reducing inertia and of having each member publicly accountable for their own views are well worth the cost of uncertainty surrounding the occasional close vote. I have a great fondness for the history of the Federal Reserve System and the role of the reserve banks. Compared to the many other agency problems that plague our financial system in both the public and private spheres, the current appointment process of Reserve Bank presidents does not loom very large for me. But that's the wrong comparison. The appointment process for Reserve Bank presidents is an unnecessary distraction for monetary policy. It carries with it the cost of undermining the Fed's legitimacy without any unique or irreplaceable benefits. Given the sweeping powers the Fed has exercised in recent years and is likely to continue to exercise, as well as the outsized role that the Fed's balance sheet has taken on in our financial system, it is time to fix the appointment process for Reserve Bank presidents so that everyone who has a say in our nation's monetary policy is appointed by our elected representatives. The current process is not consistent with what we expect in the exercise of profound governmental powers in our democracy, nor is it consistent with how monetary policy makers are selected in other countries. The committee is also too large to be an effective decision-making body for either monetary policy strategy or tactics. But we should, I believe, maintain a federal system that reflects the idea that not all wisdom is located in Washington. We should also make the Fed more specifically accountable for its actions. To accomplish these objectives, I would like to see the Federal Reserve Act amended in the following few ways. I would consolidate from 12 to 8 reserve banks and have each reserve bank president be nominated by the President of the United States and confirmed by the United States Senate to a single fixed 8-year term. I would eliminate the current Board of Governors in Washington and leave only a single chairperson in Washington who would also be nominated by the President and confirmed by the Senate to a single fixed 8-year term. All of the powers of the current Board of Governors and the Federal Open Market Committee would be vested in the committee, or board, composed of these 9 individuals, each of whom would have their own research staff to support them. To increase accountability, Congress should require the Fed to set specific objectives for itself. And here I channel some of the ideas of our mutual friend, Alan Meltzer. At the start of each year, I think the Fed should be required, A, to specify its objectives for inflation, employment, or output growth for the calendar year 3 years hence. That is, at the start of year 1 for year 3. It should specify how it plans to achieve those objectives. And third, it should account for the economy's prior year performance against objectives set by the Fed 3 years earlier. This report should be of and by the entire committee, and those who dissent from the annual report should be required to spell out their own objectives, plans, and assessments in dissenting opinions. With these changes, I believe we would have a Fed that is both more accountable to our elected representatives and one that is more effectively independent of the political cycle. We would have a Fed that aims its policies at the medium term, and we would have a Fed that maintains a federal and national character. I also hope we would have a Fed brave enough to extract itself from the fiction that low long-term interest rates everywhere and always stimulate the economy, and one with the courage to carry out its actual statutory mandate. Thank you all so much. I look forward to your questions. Come on up.
Peter's remarks will be posted on the Shadow website at 1:45 today, and all of the other Shadow members' position papers will also be posted. We'll now take questions. Yes.
Thank you. I know your remarks were directed at the Fed, but in terms of the Operation Twist period from a few years ago, we're kind of going through similar episodes today with the ECB and the BOJ, and the bank lending channels obviously been of some concern to the market. So just given their current set of circumstances, what would be your policy prescription for them?
Well, first, I think picking on something Mickey and others said earlier today, central banks somehow think they act directly on the real economy. And I just don't know how they do that. They only do it through financial conditions. Right? There is no such thing as sort of directly plugging these things into the real economy. I just don't think that's how it works. I don't think that's where their powers are. So I understand the effort. You're alluding to negative rates and other challenges. I just want to say I understand why a small open economy would think negative rates at the short end of their yield curve. If they don't have a deep capital market, they might think they'll get a good impact on the exchange rate and avoid an appreciation. I understand that. For a large economy with deep and broad capital markets, however constrained they might be, there's just too much going on in the exchange rate to have a persuasive impact. The direction ought to be the same, but there's too much else going on, as I think the ECB and the Bank of Japan have discovered. It's a long, if one were going to pass on the negative short rates to households, which I think would be folly, then you would not be further compressing net interest margins, and you might be making the actual net interest margins of lenders steeper. But to the extent you can't pass it on to households, which I think is folly, it's not going to happen. Therefore, I want to give high marks to President Draghi. He announced that bank profits were not his problem, and within 10 days, he'd swallowed those words and he started giving away large pieces of his balance sheet for free. I view that as remediation to the damage that had been done to the credit channel over the prior several years. So it's not a lot of optimism it will make a big difference, but it's always better to stop digging when you're in a hole.
Yeah, I want to get your take on the legislation that before Congress about inviting the Fed to put together a reference rule, policy rule for its actions. It sounds good, you know, you have in your proposal maybe a 3-year horizon, and then when the 3 years come, you get to say after that why things did or didn't work. But in the essence of accountability is more immediate in my mind. I have some doubts about putting things off for 3 years, whether that's going to do it. I do agree with you, we need more accountability. The reference rule legislation that some people have tried to put together says whatever the Fed uses to think about it in the way it makes policy, and the Fed is free to pick this rule. It needs to express that rule so that when there are hearings before the Congress, these hearings mean something, and the Fed can be asked, in fact, they can be asked monthly if the chairman is invited, how's things going relative to your reference rule? You know, have you deviated from it or not? There's more immediacy in my mind than waiting 3 years to have the stuff discussed. And so I kind of, and given your concerns about not only inflation, but about financial stability and the dynamic implications, you would have to, I think, implement that in some sort of reference rule so that the Fed could be held accountable for adding that piece to its, dual mandate. So what's your general thinking about the reference rule idea, its need for genuine accountability? And if you did do that, it seems to me the Fed would not, it wouldn't matter much who was on the open market committee. It'd become more like a mechanical, almost technical decision about how to deal with the economy relative to your reference rule. And, it wouldn't be such a big deal who was on this committee because they wouldn't be discretionary to that extent.
Let me. That's a great question, Marvin. Let me unpack it this way. One of my prescriptions or one of my normative judgments is monetary policy needs to aim its actions at more than one temporal dimension. So I'm sort of sharing the core insight you offered. I'm not suggesting they're not just going to aim for 3 years hence. I'm trying to get them to aim out a little further than the next election, just 1 calendar year. So that would be my first point. My second point would be that I have 3 requirements in my suggestion. The second one is specify your plans. Congress can be as proctological as they like on demanding specificity in plans. And if the Fed wants to fill that in with rules, I think they would be advised to fill it in with some rules. The legislation that I've seen is a little too prescriptive for my taste. The idea of having the GAO come in and do a double, triple Somerset audit every time the Fed deviates is, I'd be happy to have the GAO audit the Fed on a routine basis the way every other government agency is audited. I think the super special GAO audit, I don't know what they're going to uncover. But I'm skeptical about suggesting we'll get away from all judgment. And I actually, the excellent work that you did with Mervyn King for the Swedish Parliament, which I have not had a chance to do justice to, I'll just say that my own take on that as I reflected on it here is that as a matter of principle, monetary policy has to consider both the present and the future. I clearly believe that deeply. So the idea that there's an in-principle reason not to worry about financial stability or deflationary pressures in the future, I think is nuts. That leaves you with a difficult judgment about whether the Riksbank did the right thing or not, because you have to consider multiple dimensions. Because if you're trying to hit your target for 3 years hence, you can't screw it up in year 1.5. So I'm not that worried that the Fed is going to be oblivious to what goes on in years 1 and 2. But I'm happy to have the Fed required to be much more specific about its plans to achieve specific goals. I think you get into a problem if you expect Congress to just sort of nibble at them year after year and never come back and look at the 3-year track record, which is what I'm hoping there'd be some effort to. So I don't think you and I are that far apart, but those are some minor differences between us. Thank you.
Peter, I enjoy that you don't think we should micromanage or macromanage the economy. And I love your type 2 risk, basically balance sheet risk in the business cycle. What if I got really crazy on you and said, what if it's not just the business cycle, but post-Bretton Woods cycle, and that you've got decade after decade of balance sheet growth? Global balance sheets are out of control. And what if I said that a lot of that was Fed and other central bank enabled credit growth? And what I said, if I also argued that a lot of that is getting channeled into the economy in a very bad way, in a distortionary way. So yes, the Fed should not be micromanaging the economy. There's no way around the fact that a lot of these corporate buybacks or whatever financial engineering that's ongoing is largely driven by fiat money credit growth. And should that not be part of that balance sheet type 2, isn't just the business cycle or the 3-year time frame, but the instability that the monetary system is growing year in, year out. And how do you deal with that?
That is, in a sense, the ultimate question. It is why I wouldn't want to lose the current mandate, which anchors in don't let money and credit grow faster or slower than potential. Now, let's right away acknowledge all the problems. We don't know what potential is. So to Peter's point, we're going to have to I don't know if we can do that. We'll have to come up with some proxies. And we also will end up arguing about what do we do with misses. And the current statute gives the Fed no guidance on what to do if you missed, if you let it grow too fast, you let it grow too slow. We sort of have to deal with those. I think now, the railroads were invented in the late 18th century, which for me then makes bankruptcy the greatest invention of the 19th century. And one of a different talk I could have given would it be on where did macroeconomics go wrong in thinking that moral hazard was such a big problem that we should always avoid writing down debts or going to bankruptcy. It's just a trade-off. It's awkward. It's messy. But we got to learn how to write down assets. And that's one way we deal with the misses of the past. We don't pretend we're going to reinvent debtors' prisons. That just was not a good way to do things. So that's how I begin to approach, I think, the ultimate question you pose, but it is why I would want the Fed's nose to be rubbed in its actual current statutory mandate. Don't grow money and credit faster or slower, both, let's be symmetric, than productivity.
Hi, thank you, David Malpass. Very interesting remarks. Could you talk some about credit? So in my view, credit is the binding constraint that we're in now rather than the price of money. Mm-hmm. And there's the risk that that's going to persist for 10 years. We're in a credit regulation world. So as you describe the changes to the Federal Reserve Act, how would that affect, the Fed is a very powerful regulator now. So where would you put the role of credit regulation? And I don't know if you want to mention the FSOC. How do we actually make this process work over the next, say, 10 years of credit regulation? Thanks.
Yeah, good question, David. For starters, I just was very clear, all the powers of the current board and the FOMC reside in the 9 individuals I'm suggesting. So they'll have a lot of power, and they'll need to sort things out. I mean, part of your answer is bureaucratic and make 9 people, small enough group, accountable. And I've got a little more confidence that'll work out than the current diffusion we have, board staff, board of governors, reserve banks. FSOC, Congress over and over again keeps creating the pretense we're going to get our regulators to coordinate and never letting them actually do so. And so I'm all in favor of an effort to create more centralized coherence so we don't have quite such a crazy quilt of financial regulation. Congress can't bring itself to actually do it. And I think that's what's holding us back now. I'm not a fan of SIFI designation, but that's a different subject, but a little more coherence. For many years, even when I was at the Treasury more than a decade ago, I thought we could begin by having the President's Working Group, or FSOC, whatever you want to call it, have binding authority over regulations. That is, the rules that get written by all the agencies have to come through and get approved. But you still would have supervision, the hands-on stuff done by the different agencies. No, there's no, the idea of somehow we're going to get to efficiency by putting that all in one roof. I doubt it. But I thought we could demand a little more coherence in rule writing. And if someone at the top of the chain had to be coherent in rule writing, that would be a step. And that's, but you point to a great, I think making the Fed, I think others may want to correct me, I think Congress let the Fed off the hook for targeting the monetary aggregates. And Fed thought that was a get out of jail free pass for worrying about the monetary aggregates and the credit aggregates at all. And that's not what I read the current stat. I mean, no, it's credit and money. There's a nexus between credit and money, and that ought to be in the center of your viewfinder, Fed. So that's, again, part of how I would come at it.
Nisa Abuaf. My question relates to yield curve dynamics. You seem to suggest that the yield curve is flat. I thought it was relatively steep, but that may or may not be relevant. If you're a commercial bank that's borrowing short and lending long, what you're really worried about how the yield curve will evolve over time, how you mark to market your position. And if you're seriously worried about that, you can go into the Euro-dollar futures market. So your lending incentive is a function of the spread that you get, not really the level of the yield curve. I'd like you to elaborate on that.
I certainly agree with you about the spread, and if I said anything to the contrary, I don't mean that. I am, and I don't think we're saying things that different. I'm only pointing out that the Fed chose to flatten the curve. It would have been steeper, and we would have had more maturity transformation had they not chosen to flatten the curve. So this curve was steep and flat, and we can then do comparisons. I'm not saying it was tabletop flat, but I know had they not done the term extension program and forward guidance, it wouldn't have been it would have been steeper. And I would have left it there. I thought that was, you want to expand the balance sheet as much as you want, bless you. If you think the banking system is crying out for reserves or liquidity, you have some evidence of that, then grow your balance sheet. But so that, so I think we're in agreement. I'm just making a point about, and the evidence in speeches is pretty powerful that this was done to create a wealth effect. We're going to flatten the yield curve as long as we can persistently to pump up the value of assets. I don't see where Section 2A says that's something Congress asked the Fed to do. They were asked to do in a crisis. Yes, they've got a discount window and emergency lending, and they're not supposed to let the financial system implode. That's part of their mandate. But I actually, in the 1990s, when Chairman Greenspan first spoke about a wealth effect, I listened rather carefully. I was a young man inside the Fed, and I never heard Alan Greenspan say this was an objective of monetary policy. He was very clear, in my recollection, that we ought to be conscious of a wealth effect when we do what we do. There will be a positive wealth effect, there'll be a negative wealth effect. That's another channel which will come back and influence things. But I don't recall him ever saying it was an objective. I know that because I teased him and other people. I never got a reaction from him. I got the Sphinx, Cheshire cat kind of thing. But I once said, I hope we're not heading for a Nerwa. I hope we're not going to adopt the non-inflation accelerating rate of wealth accumulation. We're unpopular enough with Congress for creating and destroying jobs in order to stabilize inflation. The idea that we're going to take on the mantle of creating and destroying wealth in society in order to stabilize the variables we're in charge of, I thought would be somewhat unpopular. Now, that was a terrible forecast on my part, because lo and behold, 10 years later, that seemed to be the thrust of monetary policy. And so the idea that we have not increased inequality of wealth and inequality of income, because all sorts of sectors of the economy make their incomes off the rent of assets. So we've increased inequality of wealth and inequality of income, pursuit of a wealth effect, and I think, as Mickey was alluded to, now they've got to back out of it. And I think that's at least half the problem the Fed's having exiting. Yes, there are headwinds, the whole world is full of headwinds, but how do you stop targeting financial asset prices once you start?
Bernie, I'm going to ask you a question.
Okay.
Okay, so
Here, come to the microphone so everyone can hear.
No, you were at the Fed at every FOMC meeting. During your tenure, the Fed transitioned from its central tendency forecast, looking at the PCE deflator, and then it looked at the CPI, and then it looked at the PCE deflator, and then it looked at the core PCE deflator, all during your time there. And then in 2012, of course, they said, okay, 2% on the PCE deflator. What insights do you get from the debates back then when they transitioned to what they were looking at inflation?
Wow, Mickey, I'm not as young a man as I once was. My memory, I'm a little nervous about my memory on that point. So that's a great question. Others in the room would have opinions on that too, I think. The only summation I can give, I mean, transcripts might do a better job than I'm going to do. I think the powerful argument was, look, we care about real GDP, so let's look at the reciprocal. You know, and it's just it's just sort of tidy. And I don't know if it was that much wisdom, you know, in making the choice on that basis, but I think it was sort of a tidiness thing. We got the GDP calculation, you got PCE, you got real GDP, it's all sort of a piece. So let's make it all tidy. Let's not have to explain some discontinuity between it. Now, I may be being unfair to other arguments that unfolded, but that was my takeaway, that it was kind of a tidiness thing in the forecast. That may have been, I may be right, I may be wrong, that was the reason, that's my recollection. That's the best I can do.
Given your remarks on the efficacy of bankruptcy, which I share
Yes.
with you, where do you think you would give guidance on lender of last resort functions of the Fed? Because I noticed that we really kind of didn't talk about that directly. You have a 3-year time span and so on. So since we've had such an incredible experience between 2008, around 2008, where would you want to talk about the lender of last resort function?
Well, I thought I'd bit off enough in these remarks without giving you, Andy gets credit for saying, you know, they're already kind of long, Peter. You could cut them back a little bit. I have elsewhere explained that central bankers are a little embarrassed by their origins as lenders of last resort. My sort of Mel Brooks history of central banking is the kings of Europe figured out that being in hock to the Medicis and the Fugger family was really not much fun. They'd rather have a broader set of creditors. And it turned out if you could get a bank to liquefy the damn stuff, you could get a broader set of creditors. So we got liquid bond markets for the sovereign is how we got central banking. And in the 19th century, the Bank of England discovered that it was probably a good idea to liquefy the banking system as well as the government bond market. And only in the 20th century did we come up with the idea that central bankers should fine-tune inflation and GDP and all this stuff. So it's a completely different subject, but you brought it up. Liquidity illusion is essential to modern capitalism. It's just how the thing works. There's a fabulous quote I can't do justice to from Schumpeter with a very technical definition of maturity transformation. It's painful and Germanic. And then suddenly, these electrifying two sentences, this is not mere technique. This is a core of the capitalist process. So we can't all sell our stocks and bonds the same day, even though we think we can. And it's the nature of the system. And it's a shame that our political class doesn't understand that it's kind of something we bought into to get where we are. So I think that Paul Tucker and others are trying to think hard about how, of exit the Bank of England, what rules we could have about lender of last resort. And I haven't taken that on in earnest. I think it's a worthy topic. I think there are lots of, there's a confusion about too big to fail, moral hazard, and liquidity illusion, and not thinking of these, that we're stuck with a certain amount of liquidity illusion, and the central bankers have got to make this work. And moral hazard and favoritism, let's call it. Instead of too big to fail, I just prefer favoritism. Our government shouldn't engage in favoritism. But we also shouldn't confuse ourselves that we can completely eliminate moral hazard. In fact, I think Congress has backed in its reform of Section 13.3 into making moral hazard worse in an effort to deal with favoritism, right? So I have, that's how my analysis begins, and I don't have an answer yet. All right.
You've earned your keep.
All right.
I want to thank you very much, Peter. Excellent. That concludes our Shadow Open Market Committee. Thank all of you for coming.